The train came into Harlan Creek on a Tuesday, which was the wrong day for it. Tuesdays, the platform was quiet. The station master home for his noon meal and left the door unlocked, and anyone waiting had to wait alone with the pigeons and the sound of the wind working at the eaves. Most arrivals came on Thursdays, when the freight was heavy and there were enough men around that no single arrival drew much notice. She stepped off on a Tuesday. She carried one bag. Canvas, worn at the handles, with a buckle that had been repaired with a strip of leather that didn't match. She wore a gray dress that had been washed so many times, the gray had gone almost white at the shoulders. And she stood on the platform for a moment after the train pulled out and looked at the main street of Harlan Creek, the way a person looks at a map, when they are not sure the map is of the right place. It was October. The air had that particular flatness that comes before the first hard frost. Not cold yet, but the warmth gone out of it. The cottonwoods at the end of the street had gone yellow almost overnight, and the leaves came down in small, unhurried turns when the wind moved. She picked up her bag and walked toward town. There was a notice board outside the general store. She had the advertisement folded in her coat pocket, but she stopped in front of the board anyway, as if she needed to confirm something. The paper was still there, pinned with a single tack in the upper corner, lifting a little in the wind. 4 lines, plain type, no flourishes. Widower, one daughter, age 6, seeks capable woman for home management and child's care. Room and board, steady work. Inquire at the lumber yard. Ask for the foreman. She had read it 30 times on the train. She did not read it again. She let her eyes rest on it for a moment, and then she looked up at the street. The lumber yard was visible from where she stood, a low building set back from the main road, stacks of milled boards running along its south wall, a wagon half loaded in the yard. A man was moving near the wagon. He had his back to her, shifting boards in a way that suggested the work was almost done, that he was finishing something rather than beginning it. She crossed the street. The lumberyard gate was open. She walked through it and stopped a few feet inside and waited. She did not call out. She set her bag down at her feet and folded her hands and waited for him to turn around. When he did, he looked at her the way a man looks when he expected something but is not certain what he expected. She said, "I'm here about the notice." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Come in out of the wind." The office was a small room at the back of the yard, separated from the work floor by a low wall and a door that didn't quite square in its frame. He pulled it open and held it without looking back to check if she was following. She was. She picked up her bag and came through, and he pointed to a chair against the wall and went to the other side of a desk that was covered in paper. Invoices, she thought, and measurements written in pencil on scraps of wood. He sat down. She sat down. He was younger than she had expected, somewhere in his 30s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that comes not from ease but from long practice at keeping things inside. There was a smear of pine resin on his left wrist. He did not appear to notice it. He said, "You came from back east. It wasn't a question." She said yes anyway. He looked at the paper in front of him, though he didn't appear to be reading it. Then he said, "The arrangement is room and board and a small wage. In exchange, the house is kept and my daughter is looked after during working hours." He paused. "She's 7, she waited," he said. "She doesn't talk much." There was something careful in the way he said it. Not ashamed, not apologetic, simply precise, the way a man describes a thing he has thought about more than he lets on. She asked, "How long has it been like that?" He looked up. 2 years. She did not ask what had happened 2 years ago. The line of his jaw told her it was not something he was going to explain in an office to a woman he had met 4 minutes ago, and she did not need him to. She said, "I'm capable with children. I'm capable with a house." He looked at her steadily. The last woman lasted 3 weeks. She held his gaze. "I'm not sure what that's supposed to tell me." Something shifted in his expression. Barely, a fraction, and then it settled back. He put both hands flat on the desk. She noticed the knuckles, the flour of sawdust still in the creases of his fingers. even after however long he'd been out in the yard this morning, he said. It's a quiet house, she said. I don't mind quiet. He was still for a moment. Outside, someone in the yard called something to someone else, and a board came down with a hollow crack against the ground, and neither of them moved. Then he stood. He said, I'll take you to see it. You can decide once you've seen it. She stood too and picked up her bag. He held the crooked door open again. She went through first. The wind had picked up since she'd come inside, and it moved across the yard and lifted the edge of one of the invoices pinned to the outside wall. He didn't reach to catch it. The house was at the north end of town, past the livery and the last of the storefronts, where the road narrowed and the buildings gave way to open ground. He walked slightly ahead without meaning to, then adjusted without comment. The wind came off the flat country to the west and pushed grit along the road in low, thin sheets. The house was small. It had been painted once years before. There were two steps up to the porch, one of which sat at a slight angle, and a window facing the road with a curtain that had faded to no particular color. He opened the front door and stepped aside. Inside, a main room with a table and two chairs and a wood stove. A shelf above the stove with 4 tins on it. A doorway without a door leading back to a kitchen. Another doorway on the left with a curtain drawn across it. He stood in the center of the room with his hat in his hand. She walked the perimeter slowly. She ran her hand along the edge of the table. One of the chairs had a leg that had been repaired. She could see the join, and the work was careful, level, the kind of thing done slowly and done right. She pushed through to the kitchen. There was a counter, a dry sink, a small window above it that looked out into a dirt yard where a single cottonwood stood in the gray morning light. A hook on the wall beside the door. A second shelf with 2 more tins. She pressed her palm flat to the counter. It was clean. When she came back through, he was still standing where she'd left him. He said, There's a room off the back for you. It has a window, she waited. He said, She sleeps there. He gestured toward the curtained doorway on the left. But she won't be any trouble. She looked at the curtain. It was still. She said, Is she here now? He said, She's at the schoolhouse until 4. She doesn't speak there either, so I don't know why I keep sending her. But the teacher says she sits, and she listens, and that counts for something. She looked at the curtain for another moment. Then she looked at the 4 tins on the shelf above the wood stove. She said, What's in those? He looked at them. One's salt. I'm not sure about the others. She almost said something. She didn't. She set her bag down on the table instead, and the sound of it, the small, definite weight of it, was the only comment she made. She said, I'd like to see the room. He moved to the back of the house. She followed, past a narrow window and a peg with a child's coat hanging from it. Brown wool, one button missing near the collar, and she registered it without stopping. The room was small. A single window faced west, which meant afternoon light and cold mornings. There was a cot along one wall, a wool blanket folded at the foot of it, and a wooden crate turned on its side that served as a shelf. Nothing on the shelf. A nail in the wall above it bare. She stood in the doorway. He stood just behind her, to the left, not crowding. She crossed to the window. The glass was clean. Through it, she could see the back of the property. Short stretch of packed earth. A woodpile stacked against the fence, and beyond the fence, a line of cottonwoods going yellow at their tops. The sky above them was the pale, directionless white of late October. She said, It'll do. He said nothing. She heard him shift his weight. She turned from the window and looked at the cot. The blanket was gray, with a narrow stripe of brown near the edge. Someone had folded it evenly. She thought about who had folded it. She did not ask. She said, I'll need something to hang my things, he said. I can put up another nail, she said. That would be fine. He left to find a nail, and she stood in the room alone for a moment. The cot, the empty shelf, the bare nail. The window, with its view of the cottonwoods and the woodpile, which was stacked neatly, she noticed. The rounds split and piled with their cut faces out, the way a person stacks wood who has done it long enough to stop thinking about it. She set her hand flat on the window sill. The wood was smooth. Someone had planed it at some point, or worn it smooth over years of hands, doing exactly what she was doing now. She heard him in the other room, a drawer, a small sound of metal against wood. She looked at the nail already in the wall. Above the crate, she looked at the crate itself. There were faint marks on the inside of it, two small parallel lines scored into the wood near the bottom edge, close together, the kind a child makes with a nail or a key when no one is watching. She crouched and looked at them. Just two lines, not letters, not a picture. Just the evidence of a hand that had needed somewhere to put itself. She stood when she heard him coming back. He came through the doorway with a nail and a hammer. He looked at the wall, then at her, and she pointed to a spot to the left of the first nail, shoulder height. He set the point and drove it in 3 strokes. Clean, he stepped back. She looked at the two nails. She said, "Thank you," he said. 4 o'clock, she didn't understand at first. Then she did, the girl, the schoolhouse. She looked at the window. The cottonwoods stood still in the white afternoon, barely moving. She had 2 hours. She hung the second dress on the nail he had set and stepped back to look at both of them. They hung at slightly different heights. She adjusted the first one down a 1/4 inch on its hook. Better. The room was still bare in the way. A room is bare when the person living in it has been careful not to take up space. But it was beginning to have the shape of somewhere a person slept by choice rather than necessity. She unpacked the rest of her things without ceremony: a hairbrush, a small tin of pins, a book she had carried for 3 years and not opened in the last 2. She set them on the crate. She looked at the marks inside it again before she closed the lid. Those two small parallel lines near the bottom edge. And then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. The cottonwoods had not moved. She thought about the girl. She had been told almost nothing, that she did not speak, that she was 6, that she had stopped after her mother died. She had been told this by the woman at the agency, in a tone that was both clinical and faintly apologetic, as though the silence were a defect in goods being represented honestly. She had not told the woman what she thought about that. She thought about it now. She had known a boy once who stopped speaking after a flood took their barn and 3 horses. He was 12. He started again 7 months later in the middle of breakfast, asked for more salt, and no one said anything about the gap. She did not know if this meant anything about the girl. She suspected it meant that silence was not always waiting to be fixed. She washed her face from the basin. The water was cold and still, and she dried her hands on the cloth hanging from the peg and looked at herself in the small square of mirror above the washstand. She looked like what she was, a woman at the edge of something she had agreed to without fully knowing what it was. She looked steady enough. At 10 minutes to 4, she came out of her room and found her coat on the hook by the door. He was already standing in the main room, hat in hand. He did not look up when she came out. He turned the hat twice by the brim, a slow rotation, and then set it on his head with the flat finality of a man who has made a decision about how long to stay somewhere. "Ready, tea," he said. It was not a question. She buttoned the top button of her coat. Outside the window, the light had gone pale and thin, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look like it happened a long time ago. She said yes. They went out. The town looked different at 4 in the afternoon than it did at any other hour. The angle of the light flattened everything, turned the storefronts into cutouts, made the mud in the street look permanent. She had noticed this in her first days here and had not stopped noticing it. He walked a half step ahead of her, not from rudeness but from habit. The habit of a man who moved through space with some sense of where he was going and expected to get there without ceremony. She matched her pace to his without effort. They did not speak. The schoolhouse was at the north end of the main street, set back from the road by a short stretch of bare ground that in spring might have been grass. A small porch, one window. A door that stood open now, children moving through it in the unhurried chaos of a day just ending. She saw the girl before he did. She was standing at the edge of the porch, not in the stream of children moving past her, but beside it. Her lunch pail hung from both hands in front of her, held against her shins. She was watching the other children the way someone watches a river, not looking for anything, just watching the movement of it. He went forward and crouched to her level. He said something she could not hear from where she stood. The girl did not answer. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, with full attention and with complete stillness, the way a person looks at something they understand completely and have nothing to add to. She stayed back. It was not deliberate strategy. She was simply standing where she was standing, at the foot of the porch steps, and something told her to stay there, to let the girl see her from a little distance before she was any closer. The girl looked up, not at him, past him. Their eyes met across 15 feet of packed dirt, the light coming in low and pale over the roofline behind her. The girl's expression did not change. It was not cold and it was not curious. It was the expression of a person who was assessing something very carefully and had not yet finished. She did not smile. She did not bend down or wave or make her face into something soft and coaxing. She just stood there in her coat with the button she had done up before leaving. And she looked back. The girl looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at her father, and then back at her. Then she stepped off the porch and came down the 2 steps and walked across the dirt and stopped a foot away. She was still holding the lunch pail against her shins. She tilted her chin up. She looked at her father again briefly. Then she looked back. "You're the lady." "You're the lady, not a question. Just a thing stated, the way a child states facts to confirm they are true." She said, "Yes." The girl considered this. Her eyes were her father's eyes. That same quality of looking that did not slide away from what it found. She held the lunch pail with both hands now, the bale wire across her palms, and she studied her the way she had studied the porch steps a minute before, methodically, not unkind. Her father had not moved from where he stood. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a held breath. The girl said, "You're coming to stay," she said, "for a while, to help with some things around the house." The girl looked at the coat button, then at her face again. "What things?" she said, "cooking, mostly. Whatever else needs doing." The girl seemed to weigh this. She looked down at her lunch pail, then back up. "Papa burns the beans." She heard him make a sound behind her that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough. She said, "I can do better than that." The girl did not smile. But something in her face shifted. Not much and not for long, but it was there. Some small adjustment of tension around the eyes. She said, "I'm the one who sets the table," she said. "Good. Then you can show me where things go." The girl looked at her for another long moment, the way she had looked from the porch, still assessing, still not finished. Then she turned and walked back to the steps without a word and climbed them, and went inside and let the door close behind her. The sound of it was not a slam, just a door going shut. She stood where she was. The light was still coming in low over the roofline, and the packed dirt between them was empty now, and the lunch pail was sitting on the top porch step where the girl had set it on her way in. She heard him come up beside her. He said, she talked, he said it quietly, not to her exactly, to the air in front of them, the way you say a thing out loud to make it real. She did not answer right away. She was still looking at the porch step, at the lunch pail sitting there with the bale wire folded flat. Then she said she did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She hasn't said that many words to a person she didn't already know. Not since," and then he stopped. She did not fill the silence. She let it sit where he had left it. After a moment, he picked up her bag from where he had set it down in the dirt and carried it toward the porch. She followed. The door was still closed. Behind it she could hear small, precise movements, the sound of a table being set. He opened the door and stood back. She went in first. The girl was at the table, the plates set out with the edges aligned, the forks placed to the left with the care of someone who has learned that doing a thing correctly is a way of being safe. She did not look up right away. Her hands were folded in her lap. He set the bag down inside the door. The room was warm from the stove. There was bread on the counter. a loaf she had left that morning, and the girl had sliced 2 pieces and set them on a small plate between the 2 larger ones. She had not been asked. She had simply done it. She looked at the bread, then at the girl. The girl looked up then, not at her father, at her. Her eyes were the same gray as the morning had been, patient gray, watching gray, the kind of eyes that had learned to read a room before deciding anything. She said, "Thank you for setting the table." It was a plain thing to say. She meant it plainly. The girl looked at her for a moment, then gave a single, small nod and looked back down at her hands. He moved to the stove without a word. She heard him check the firebox, the small iron sound of it, and then the scrape of a pot being shifted on the grate. She stood for a moment near the door, not quite belonging to the room yet, not quite outside it either. The girl glanced up again. Then she said, "You left before the bread was done." It was directed at her, quietly, without accusation, just the fact of it, offered across the table the way you might hand something to a person whose hands were full. She said, "I did. I should have waited." The girl considered this. Then she said, "It didn't burn." She said, "That's because you watched it." The girl said nothing after that, but her hands came unfolded from her lap and lay flat on the table, and something in the set of her shoulders changed, loosened, only slightly, only just enough to see if you were paying attention. He had turned from the stove. He was looking at his daughter with his hands at his sides, and his face had the expression of a man watching something he had stopped believing in and had not yet learned to call hope. She did not look at him. She pulled the chair back across from the girl and sat down. Outside, the light had shifted. The afternoon was beginning to go bronze at the edges, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is already a memory. Inside, the stove ticked. The bread sat between them on its plate. The girl reached out and straightened the fork that was already straight. He stood at the stove for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he turned back to whatever he had been doing there. Though the pot did not need tending, and the fire did not need adjusting, and his hands found the edge of the counter and held it. She kept her eyes on the girl. The girl's fork was already straight. She had made it so. She seemed to know this, and left her hand resting beside it anyway, one finger touching the handle. After a while she said, "Do you want butter on it?" The girl looked at the bread. She said, "Does it need it?" She said, "No, but it's better." The girl considered this with the same gravity she gave most things, fully, without hurry, as if the question deserved the same weight as any other. Then she said, "Yes." She got up and found the crock on the shelf near the window. She brought it back and set it between them. She cut 2 slices, not 3, and spread them both and set one in front of the girl, one in front of herself, and left the knife on the edge of the plate. She did not look at him to see if he wanted some. He had not moved from the counter. The girl took a bite. She chewed. She looked out the window at the bronze light, flattening itself across the yard, the long shadow of the fence post stretching toward the house. She said, "It's different when you make it." She said, "Different how?" The girl thought about it. She said, "Quieter." She sat with that. She did not ask what the girl meant. She understood it in the way you understand a thing that has been true for you too, for longer than you realized. That bread made in a quiet house tastes different from bread made in a loud one, and that some people know this without being able to say why, and some people will never know it at all. Outside, a horse somewhere down the street, a door. The particular quality of late afternoon, settling over a small town like a hand laid flat. He came away from the counter finally. He took a plate from the shelf and cut himself a slice and stood at the far end of the table, eating it without sitting down. His eyes went to the window. His jaw moved. He was careful not to look at either of them with anything that could be named. The girl finished her bread. She folded her hands in her lap again. Old habit, that, and then seemed to catch herself and set them flat on the table once more. The stove ticked. She reached out and cut another slice and set it on the girl's plate without asking. The girl did not say anything. She picked it up and took a bite. He finished the bread standing. He set the plate down and looked at it for a moment. then turned and went to the door and took his coat from the hook. She heard the latch, the door opening not all the way. A pause in the frame, she did not turn. Behind her, she heard the girl slide off the bench, small feet on the floorboards. She heard her stop somewhere near the middle of the room, and she did not turn for that either. Only kept her hands on the table and waited. The door closed. The girl came and stood beside her, not asking for anything, simply standing the way she had stood on the platform, still watching, with that quality of attention that made you feel assessed by something old enough to know what it was looking for. She looked down at her, the girl looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then the girl reached out and touched the edge of the bread cloth with one finger. Just the edge. The way you touch something you are not sure you are allowed to want. She folded the cloth back and cut another slice and put it on the girl's plate. The girl sat back down. She ate slowly, looking at the window. Outside, the light was going amber and thin, the way it did here in autumn when the days started shortening faster than you expected. You would look up and find an hour gone from the afternoon. Pocketed somewhere you could not find it. She rose and went to the stove and checked the kettle. Not because she needed to. Something to do with her hands. Behind her, the girl set down her bread. She heard the small sound of it. And then she heard something else, not a word exactly. A sound that had the shape of a word inside it, the way you can see a figure in fog before the fog has actually moved. She did not turn immediately. She let the moment stay where it was. Then she turned slowly and looked at the girl, who was sitting with her hands flat on the table now, and her eyes on the window and her mouth slightly open, as though she had surprised herself. She came back to the table and sat down. They were quiet together for another minute. The light came through the window at a low angle and laid itself across the flour dust, still on the boards, and the two plates, and the bread cloth, and the girl's still hands. It found what it needed and rested there. Outside, somewhere down the street, she could hear him. The sound of a hammer, slow and even, not urgent. Just the sound of a man doing what he knew how to do, while something he could not measure was happening in his own kitchen without him. She poured a second cup of coffee and set it where the girl could see it but not reach it. Not an invitation, not a test, just something warm in the room. The girl looked at it. She began cutting the bread into portions, working from one end. The knife made a clean sound against the board. She kept the cuts even. Her hands knew how to do this without thought, and that was the point. To give the silence something regular to rest against. The girl shifted in her chair. She did not look up. 3 minutes passed in the ordinary way. The hammer down the street continued its slow rhythm. A horse moved somewhere beyond the window. The light had not changed. It was still lying where it had landed, patient and uncommitted. Then the girl said a word. It came out small and with a question underneath it, the way a word does when someone has been carrying it so long, they no longer trust their own voice to hold it. She said it clearly enough to be certain, and quietly enough that it might have been a breath. She set the knife down. She did not turn immediately. She had learned, in these weeks, that turning too fast closed the door before it had finished opening. She stayed where she was and let the words settle. Then she said, yes, not facing her, still at the board. Her voice level and without ceremony, the way you answer something that deserves an honest response more than a careful one. The girl made a sound that was almost assent. She turned then, slowly, and came back to the table and sat. She did not look directly at her at first. She looked at the bread, at her own hands, at the window where the light came through. Then she looked at the girl. The girl was looking back. It was not a long look. The girl dropped her eyes to the table after a moment, and her hands moved. Just slightly, just the small adjustment of a person who has been holding something still for a very long time and has relaxed without intending to. She reached across and moved the cup of coffee to the center of the table, between them. The girl looked at it. She did not offer anything else. No questions, no sound that would make the moment larger than it could hold. She simply stayed at the table, and let the silence have a different quality than it had before. Not empty, the way it had been, but full of something that did not need naming. Outside, the hammer stopped, a beat of quiet, then it started again. She became aware that she had been holding her shoulders high, without knowing it, and she let them down, slowly, like something that had been braced against weather that had finally passed. That evening he came in from the porch and washed his hands at the basin, and she set 3 plates on the table the way she had begun to do without deciding to. Not as a gesture, simply as the arrangement that fit the room. The girl sat in her chair, the same chair she had taken the first week, pulled slightly back from the table as if she had not yet committed to the meal, but she sat in it. She always sat in it. He took his place and she set the bread between them and sat down herself. And for a while there was only the sound of the meal, the soft movements, the cup set down, the fork against the plate. Then the girl said, more not loudly, not even clearly at first. It was the kind of word that a person could have let pass unremarked, could have decided they had misheard if they had wanted to. She did not look up immediately. She picked up the bread and broke a piece and set it on the girl's plate. Her hands were steady. She was aware of him going very still across the table. Not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of someone who has learned to be careful with things that are fragile. The girl looked at the bread. She picked it up. She did not say anything else that night, nor did he. They finished the meal, and he brought wood in for the morning, and the girl went to the small room where she slept, and the house settled into its quiet the way it always did. The same sounds in the same order, the wind at the corner of the eave, the single creak of the floor near the door. She stood at the window for a while after. The street outside was dark, one light across the way, and the distant sound of something that might have been a dog, or only the wind finding a gap somewhere. He came and stood beside her, not close, just near. He did not speak. She did not speak. They stood there a moment, watching the dark, and then he said, quiet, the way he said most things. She hasn't done that before, I know, she said. A beat. I know she hasn't, he nodded. She could see it only at the edge of her vision, the slow downward movement of his head. Then he turned and went to the chair by the stove, and she stayed at the window a little longer, her hands loose at her sides. The light across the street went out. She let the curtain fall. In the morning there were 2 cups already on the counter when she came in, and beside them, small, placed without comment, a third.